The horror beneath the hills of Oregon. In the remote eastern hills of Oregon, where silence drapes the pines like mourning cloth and the soil is rich with untold stories, lies a history. So chilling, it was buried deliberately for over a century. Between 1852 and 1888, more than 800 pioneers traveling the Oregon Trail simply vanished along a 20-mile stretch of rugged terrain. These weren't random disappearances attributed to disease or wild animals. No, these were people, entire families swallowed whole by something more calculating, more deliberate, and infinitely darker. At the heart of this horrific legacy stood a modest structure, the Sacred Heart Chapel. A wooden church built atop a hill, it promised rest for the weary, prayers for the dying, and comfort for the grieving. But it was no sanctuary. Behind its modest altar and Christian hymns hid a machine of death more precise and cold than anything the frontier had seen. And at the center of that machine stood the Grayson family, Father Morai, his devoted wife, Sister Constance, and his younger brother, Ezekiel. What began as a story of religious hospitality quickly devolved into one of the most well-organized mass murder operations in American history. Their weapon was trust, their disguise devotion, and their motive profit wrapped in Scripture. The story that follows is not just a tale of death, but of betrayal at the deepest level, the betrayal of faith, of kindness, and of our most vulnerable hopes. This is a descent into the anatomy of evil, how it smiles, how it prays, and how it thrives in the disguise of righteousness. The Oregon Trail, hope, disease, and vulnerability. A road of dreams and graves. The Oregon Trail was more than just a migration route. It was a vein of hope pulsing through the American frontier. Stretching over 2,000 miles from Missouri to the Willamette Valley, the trail carried thousands of families westward, chasing freedom, farmland, and new beginnings. But hope had a price. For every wagon that reached Oregon, many others were reduced to skeletons of wood and bone, shattered by starvation, river crossings, cholera, and despair. By 1852, the trail's busiest year, more than 50,000 souls pushed west, enduring relentless hardship. When these exhausted families reached the Blue Mountains in Oregon, they were nearly broken. Food supplies dwindled. Livestock perished. Children fell ill. Death was no longer an abstract possibility, it was part of the journey. And in those final miles, any glimmer of help, a bucket of clean water, a place to bury the dead, or a comforting prayer, became a miracle. It was in this perfect storm of fatigue, faith, and fear that the Grayson family waited. A chapel among the pines. The Sacred Heart Chapel, perched just off the trail near a natural resting area, appeared like a godsend. It was a simple structure built of local timber with a shingled roof and a small adjoining cemetery. Inside, a rough-hewn cross stood solemnly over a makeshift altar. Wooden pews lined the room. Candles burned day and night. A fire crackled softly in the hearth. To passers-by, it was the very image of peace, a spiritual lighthouse in a landscape of suffering. Most who arrived had no idea they were walking into a trap. The Graysons' Father Morai, Sister Constance, and Brother Ezekiel lived nearby and welcomed visitors with warm smiles and open arms. They offered rest, prayer, medicine, assistance with repairs, and always reassurance that God was watching over them. No denomination was ever a problem. Catholic, Baptist, Lutheran, it didn't matter. Father Morai could quote the Bible in any flavor. His voice, calm and resonant, lulled the most skeptical into a sense of peace. Travelers didn't realize they weren't meeting a minister, they were meeting their executioner. Wolves in shepherd's clothing. What made the Graysons so effective wasn't just their setting, it was their precision. They didn't act like lunatics or brutish killers. They acted like caretakers. Morai possessed the charisma of a seasoned preacher and the composure of a general. Sister Constance played the healer, soft-spoken, graceful, with eyes full of understanding. Ezekiel, with his weathered hands and easy smile, filled the role of the helpful laborer, always ready to fix a wheel or tend to sick oxen. Together they created a facade so complete, even seasoned travelers let their guard down. The Graysons understood something most criminals didn't. People trust those who ease their suffering. And on the Oregon Trail, where everyone had suffered, a kind face and a bowl of hot soup could disarm even the most vigilant. They waited patiently, noting signs of health conditions and group dynamics. They didn't rush. The art of killing for them was ritualistic, rehearsed, and cloaked in piety. And when the time came to poison, they did so slowly, methodically, so that no one ever suspected the holy trinity of death was seated right beside them. The Morrison family. The first victims, a broken wagon, a fateful encounter. On September 23, 1852, the Morrison family, James, his pregnant wife Elizabeth, their 3 children, and Elizabeth's aging father broke away from a larger wagon train after reaching Oregon Territory. Like many hopeful settlers, they believed the hardest part of the journey was behind them. Their wagon was sturdy, their spirits cautiously optimistic. But just 2 miles shy of the Blue Mountains, a cracked axle brought their progress to a halt. It was then through a break in the trees and a streak of late afternoon sun that they first saw the steeple of the Sacred Heart Chapel. James would later be quoted in official documents as saying, "It appeared like a beacon placed by God himself." Within hours, help arrived. Brother Ezekiel, dusty from the road, and seemingly heaven-sent, appeared with tools in hand, and an invitation. "The Lord has guided you here for a reason." The Graysons, he said, would offer shelter, care, and prayer. What seemed like divine intervention was in truth a predator's perfect moment. Hospitality with a hidden price. The Morrisons moved into a small guest cabin next to the chapel, a structure the Graysons specifically maintained for families in need. For 3 days, all appeared normal. Sister Constance assisted Elizabeth, who was nearing labor, with warm cloths and soothing teas. Ezekiel worked alongside James to repair the wagon, exchanging tales of the frontier. Father Morai provided prayer and scripture readings that brought comfort to the weary family. The children played beneath the trees while Elizabeth's father, Samuel, rested in a rocking chair near the hearth. The tranquility was almost suspiciously perfect. On the 4th day, Samuel developed stomach cramps and a pallid complexion. Sister Constance diagnosed trail sickness, a common term for any number of vague exhaustion-related ailments, and prepared what she called blessed remedies from herbs stored in the chapel basement. Her words soothed, but her medicine concealed death. What began as a stomachache quickly spiraled into violent vomiting, shallow breathing, and hallucinations. When James suggested riding east to the trading post for help, Father Morai counseled against it. To move him now would be to invite death, he said, with pastoral authority. "We must trust in the Lord's timing," a pattern of poison and prayer. Within a week, the family's children, 7-year-old Tommy and 5-year-old Mary, began to show similar symptoms. Pale skin, labored breathing, pain that came in waves. Elizabeth, still miraculously healthy, cared for them tirelessly with Constance at her side, neither realizing the source of their agony. The Graysons offered spiritual reassurance through evening hymnals and tender gestures. Father Morai led candle-lit prayers, promising the family they were being prepared for glory. As each child died, first Tommy on day 9, then Mary on day 11, James and Elizabeth wept, but thanked the Graysons for their kindness. What they didn't know was that arsenic was coursing through their children's blood, carefully administered in each healing tea. The timing of deaths was not accidental, it was calculated. One by one, the Graysons stripped the family of both its members and its will to resist maintaining the illusion of divine tragedy. In reality, they had perfected the slow murder of an entire family without arousing a shred of suspicion. The final blow. From faith to death. On the 12th day, James himself began to show symptoms. Elizabeth, now in early labor, pleaded with the sister Constance to save her husband. The woman's response was chilling. "Some illnesses are God's way of calling his children home," she whispered while clasping Elizabeth's hands. "You must trust in his mercy." James died on the 14th day, just hours before his wife gave birth. The baby survived long enough for Father Moray to perform a baptism, naming him Samuel. 3 days later, Elizabeth herself succumbed to the poison. In less than 3 weeks, an entire family had vanished. Their bodies were buried behind the chapel in unmarked graves. Their possessions, fine tools, hidden coins, heirlooms were sorted by Ezekiel, their worth logged meticulously in a hidden ledger. And when the next wagon came into view days later, the Graysons were ready. The Morrisons, to any outsider, had simply died of disease. But to the Graysons, they were a successful transaction. Death, when wrapped in scripture and sorrow, had become profitable. The business of murder transformation into a criminal enterprise. From tragedy to blueprint. The Morrison family's annihilation was not merely a crime, it was a prototype. As the Graysons closed the door on the first set of shallow graves behind the chapel, they weren't plagued by remorse. Instead, they dissected every step of the process with the precision of businessmen reviewing their quarterly returns. They evaluated the timing of symptoms, the emotional responses of survivors, and the ease with which the possessions were transferred. Their hidden ledger, a thick-bound volume kept in the chapel's basement, was updated with chilling specificity: Morrison family 5 souls. 14 days method tea-based arsenic. Inventory: coins, tools, heirlooms. Estimated yield $412. This was no longer opportunistic violence. It was strategic refinement. They had learned that individual family members should be allowed to die gradually, not all at once, to prevent suspicion. They discovered that performing elaborate Christian funerals soothed grieving survivors, dulling their instincts to question the sequence of deaths. More importantly, they realized that trail families were the perfect targets, isolated, undocumented, and unlikely to be missed for months. Expansion and specialization. By the winter of 1852, the Graysons were no longer missionaries. They were operators. During the off-season, when the Oregon Trail saw fewer travelers, the family used the lull to reorganize and upgrade their methods. The basement of Sacred Heart Chapel was expanded into 3 sections, one for arsenic storage and preparation, another for inventorying victims' belongings, and a third for preserving corpses temporarily before burial. Brother Ezekiel began traveling to nearby settlements under the pretense of trading on behalf of travelers who had turned back east, fencing items through various channels to avoid arousing suspicion. His quiet demeanor and rural charm made him believable. Meanwhile, Sister Constance fine-tuned her techniques with arsenic, experimenting with various dosages and delivery methods. She found that tinctures dissolved into peppermint tea or communion wine yielded the best results. Slow deterioration, maximum deniability. Father Morai's role became increasingly psychological, adapting sermons to reflect each victim's denomination, customizing his spiritual narrative to each family's vulnerability. The trio had evolved into a finely tuned organism of deceit, victim selection, and trail surveillance. In spring 1853, the Graysons began proactively scouting for targets. Ezekiel, now functioning like a field agent, would ride out several miles along the trail in both directions, studying the incoming traffic. He noted the size of wagon groups, health of livestock, presence of children or elderly, each a factor in determining vulnerability. Families traveling alone were ideal. Those already dealing with illness or broken equipment were prime candidates. Ezekiel would ride alongside them briefly, offering kind conversation and gauging their wealth by their clothing accents and wagon contents. If they passed the threshold, appeared wealthy enough, desperate enough, he'd suggest stopping by the Sacred Heart Chapel for a rest. In most cases, families welcomed the offer. They believed he was just another kind soul offering Christian hospitality. What they didn't realize was that they'd just been assessed, marked, and scheduled for extermination. Once selected, the Graysons followed a script shelter, care, prayer, poison, burial, liquidation. It became a process so routine they could manage multiple families in a single month without raising any alarm. Profiting in the shadows. One of the most horrifying elements of the Grayson operation was not just the scale of the murder, but the cold, systematic monetization of their victims. Furniture and heirlooms were sold to settlers eager to furnish new homes. Farming tools and hunting rifles fetched high prices in the expanding Oregon frontier. Jewelry and coins were melted down or traded to black market buyers who asked no questions. The Graysons kept detailed records of every item, its market value, the method of acquisition, and the location it was sold. Their ledgers read like an inventory for a general store, with one key difference: every line represented the residue of a slaughtered life. By the end of 1853, they had killed 3 families, netting thousands in goods and coin. Yet what disturbed later investigators most wasn't the wealth, it was the language of those records. Nowhere did the Graysons describe emotions, faces, or memories. Instead, their victims were referred to as units cases or souls processed. Murder had become a business, and they were thriving. The Hoffman family and evolution of killing techniques, a family of promise, meets a house of death. In May of 1853, the Graysons encountered their next target. The Hoffman family, a group of German immigrants making their way westward toward California. Heinrich Hoffman, a skilled clockmaker, traveled with his pregnant wife Greta and their 3 children, ages 6 to 12. Their wagon was not only loaded with tools, textiles, and household goods, but also with a life's worth of gold coins hidden deep within layers of clothing and wooden compartments. Language barriers made the Hoffmans stand out among other travelers. Though they were friendly and polite, they relied on broken English and gestures to communicate with strangers. That dependency would become their undoing. When mechanical trouble halted their wagon near Sacred Heart Chapel, Brother Ezekiel once again emerged at just the right moment. The family was visibly grateful for his help and eagerly accepted his invitation to rest at the chapel. With no suspicions raised and no extended network of contacts in the area, they walked, smiling and tired, into the trap. A new experiment in poison. This time, the Graysons sought to improve upon their technique. Instead of waiting for natural sickness or signs of weakness, Sister Constance began administering minuscule doses of arsenic, almost immediately disguised as preventative medicine. Blessed protection, she called it. These were small enough to avoid triggering alarm, but consistent enough to begin undermining the family's health within days. Greta, being pregnant, was given fortifying teas laced with slightly higher concentrations. The children received calming tonics meant to ease the stress of travel. Heinrich, a cautious and intelligent man, was treated with special reverence. His hands were his livelihood, and Sister Constance was careful not to give him reason to doubt their intentions. This calculated approach allowed the Graysons to observe the family's daily patterns, assess their possessions more thoroughly, and determine the exact moment each member became vulnerable enough to eliminate. For nearly 4 weeks, they executed this plan in silence, watching the Hoffmans decline one family member at a time. No one questioned the sudden shift from exhaustion to death. After all, trail life was hard, and God's will was often cruel. A murder refined into ritual. The slow unraveling of the Hoffman family gave the Graysons an opportunity to take their methods to new extremes of psychological and logistical control. For the first time, they coordinated the timing of each death, not just to match the pace of illness, but to align with the family's growing emotional dependence on them. Sister Constance would increase arsenic doses following emotional high points like the death of Greta's unborn child, which she falsely framed as a miscarriage due to stress. Each tragedy drew the surviving family members deeper into the Graysons' embrace, creating a twisted feedback loop of trust and torment. The murders weren't just happening, they were being choreographed. When Heinrich finally succumbed to the poison, he did so in the arms of Father Morai, who held his hand and whispered scripture in German. Days later, the last child died. With the entire family gone, the Graysons stripped the wagon clean. Heinrich's clock-making tools were carefully packed and sold weeks later in a town 2 counties over. Their coins were melted down and never traced. But most haunting of all was what Father Morai wrote in the ledger, Family No. 7 Hoffman. Method: low-dose arsenic over 24 days. Emotional management successful. Losses none. Lessons learned: early introduction of remedies yields complete compliance. Estimated value $970 or less. The murders were no longer mere killings. They were rehearsed performances perfected for maximum psychological effect and material gain. The Weatherby family, a near exposure. Suspicion on arrival. In the summer of 1854, the Graysons encountered a new kind of challenge: the Weatherby family from Tennessee. Charles Weatherby, a former Confederate officer with sharp instincts and battlefield experience, was traveling west with his wife Margaret, their twin daughters Sarah and Susan, and Margaret's younger brother David, a skilled blacksmith. Unlike previous victims, the Weatherbys were cautious, alert, and well prepared. Their wagon was custom reinforced, and Charles had converted much of his wealth into gold coins and jewelry hidden in a secret compartment. When their wagon suffered a broken wheel not far from Sacred Heart, chapel, Ezekiel appeared as always, offering help. But Charles, unlike others, was wary. He declined the invitation at first. Something about the isolated location and the perfectly timed appearance of help struck him as too convenient. Yet when Father Morai later arrived in person and calmly mentioned outbreaks of trail fever in the area, Margaret grew concerned. Charles finally agreed to stay temporarily, just until we're sure it's not cholera, he muttered. The trap had been baited again, but this time the prey was watching the hunter. The careful deception begins recognizing Charles's military background and perceptiveness. The Graysons modified their approach. They dialed back their religious intensity and leaned into subtlety. Morai praised Charles's discipline and strength, even implying admiration for his leadership. This flattery, combined with Constance's gentle charm and knowledge of women's health, began to soften Margaret's defenses. David, who had developed a mild fever from trail exposure, was the first to receive treatment. "A blessed infusion," Constance said, handing him a small cup of herb-laced water. Within days, he began to deteriorate. When Margaret voiced concerns, Morai explained it was likely the fever taking its toll. They had seen it many times before. "Trust in the Lord's mercy," he said, "and in my wife's healing touch." But Charles remained uneasy. His instincts sharpened each time Constance retreated to the basement to prepare her remedies, always alone, always locked in. And Ezekiel, he noticed, took a little too much interest in their wagon storage. Still, with Margaret exhausted and his daughters just beginning to show signs of fatigue, he felt trapped, stay and risk death, or leave and risk collapse on the trail. Cracks in the illusion. As David grew weaker, Charles began to keep notes. He tracked when each person began showing symptoms, what they had eaten or drunk, and how closely that correlated with their interactions with the Graysons. The patterns disturbed him. The sickest family members were the ones most frequently treated. The healthiest, himself and the twins, had ingested the least. His suspicions solidified when he caught Ezekiel rifling through their supply chest late one night. When confronted, Ezekiel claimed he was securing food from wildlife. It was plausible, but not convincing. The next morning, Charles searched a chapel alone and discovered a storage cabinet containing personal items, clearly not belonging to the Graysons, a doll with a child's initials, a pocket watch inscribed with another family's name, and most damning, a letter written by a woman to her relatives in Oregon City. The letter thanked the loving Christian family at Sacred Heart Chapel for their care, but the postmark was dated months ago, and it had never been sent. Too late to escape. Realizing the truth, Charles rushed back to the cabin where his wife lay dying. The girls were beginning to fade. The poison had worked its way into their blood. Margaret, pale and barely conscious, wept as Charles told her everything. "We need to leave," he said tonight. But Margaret was too weak to move. Torn between escape and protecting his family, Charles chose to stay one more night, hoping for strength in the morning. That decision sealed his fate. The Graysons had noticed his suspicions. That night, Morai visited the Weatherby cabin with evening communion. Charles accepted it out of courtesy, only to collapse in agony hours later. The dose had been massive. As he lay dying, he tried to warn his daughters. "They're not what they seem," he whispered, reaching for Sarah's hand. But the girls, confused and frightened, believed he was hallucinating. The next morning, Charles Weatherby was dead. and the daughters clung tighter to the only family they believed still cared for them. Lessons in control. The Weatherby case became a pivotal moment for the Graysons. While they successfully eliminated the entire family, the near exposure forced them to reevaluate their methods. They realized that intelligent, disciplined victims required more sophisticated manipulation. They began forging testimonials from fictional families to preempt suspicion and included stories of healing that never happened. They spaced out deaths more carefully and increased their use of sedatives to dull alertness. More importantly, they revised their evidence management. From then on. Any personal item that could be traced was either burned buried or melted. Marai's journal entry for the Weatherbys was clinical but telling: family number 10, Weatherby. Difficulty high. Profile: suspicious ex-military. Solution: increased psychological engagement, accelerated dose. Result: success. Losses: minimal. Note: future high-risk targets require slower integration and extended emotional trust building. Do not underestimate trained men again. The Graysons had stared down the possibility of failure and survived. Now they were more dangerous than ever. The Patterson family, the survivors who exposed the truth. A prosperous family walks into the trap. In late summer 1855, the Graysons encountered the Patterson family from Ohio, wealthy, well-respected, and devastatingly unaware of the danger ahead. Thomas Patterson, a successful merchant, had liquidated his business to seek new ventures in Oregon. He traveled with his wife Emily, their 4 children aged 8 to 16, and Emily's unmarried sister Catherine, who served as teacher and caregiver. Their wagon was well stocked, their clothes clean, and their confidence high. When Brother Ezekiel approached them 5 miles east of the chapel, he noted the family's polish and affluence immediately. "Quality oxen, sir," he greeted Thomas. "We keep fresh supplies up ahead if you care to trade." Though Thomas was initially skeptical, Ezekiel casually mentioned mountain fever spreading nearby. Emily's face changed instantly. A mother's fear for her children is often stronger than any man's reason. By nightfall, the Patterson family had arrived at Sacred Heart Chapel, completely unaware they were walking into a predator's den. The first to question. From the start, Catherine Patterson stood out. Intelligent, observant, and naturally skeptical, she was less susceptible to charm than her sister or nieces and nephews. When Sister Constance began administering herbal preventatives, Catherine accepted them politely but secretly stored the medicine instead of drinking it. She noticed subtle things: how Ezekiel inventoried their wagon late at night, how Father Morai seemed more interested in Thomas's pocket watch than his prayers, and how Constance always prepared treatments behind locked doors. On the second evening, Catherine caught a glimpse of the white powder Constance added to a child's dose. Blessed salt, she was told. But Catherine had grown up in her father's apothecary back in Ohio. That wasn't salt. It wasn't even close. A silent decision to resist. Determined to uncover the truth, Catherine convinced young Timothy, the family's youngest child, to join her in a secret game. When offered medicine, they would pretend to swallow, but discreetly spit it into a handkerchief. Within 2 days, the difference was undeniable. While Thomas, Emily, and the other children began to weaken, Catherine and Timothy remained healthy. The twins developed fevers. Emily became fatigued. Thomas was bedbound. Catherine's fear turned into cold, deliberate calculation. She now knew the family was being poisoned. But how could she escape, especially with her sister slipping toward unconsciousness when Emily remained lucid enough to whisper her fears? Catherine told her everything. At first, Emily wept in disbelief. "They prayed with us," she gasped. But as the pattern became clearer, she understood. They had to run. A desperate midnight escape. On the 6th night, with her family dying around her, Catherine enacted her plan. She woke Emily and Timothy in the dead of night and helped them to the wagon where she had hidden gold coins, maps, and supplies. Thomas and the older children were too weak to move. The decision to leave them behind would haunt Catherine for the rest of her life. As they prepared to leave, they heard footsteps. Father Morai. "You should be resting, sister," he said, tone strangely flat. "Mountain fever causes confusion." But Catherine played it calm. "I was checking on the oxen," she replied. "Couldn't sleep." Then suddenly Emily appeared behind the wagon armed with Thomas's pistol. "Step away from my sister," she said, voice shaking. In that instant, Catherine grabbed an iron tool and struck Morai in the head. The blow wasn't fatal, but it was enough. They fled into the night, knowing they were now being hunted. 3 days through hell. The journey that followed was more nightmare than escape. With no map and only vague knowledge of nearby settlements, Catherine drove the wagon through dense forest, unfamiliar paths, and endless fear. Emily drifted in and out of consciousness, and young Timothy barely spoke. They avoided trails moving like fugitives. On the 4th day, a miracle, they encountered a military patrol from Fort Dow. The soldiers were skeptical at first until Catherine produced the vial of medicine, the powder samples, and detailed testimony. Emily's failing condition confirmed the poisoning. Catherine's calm, precise recounting of events and the evidence she carried immediately triggered an investigation. Truth unveiled, horror confirmed. When federal troops arrived at Sacred Heart Chapel, it was already too late for the rest of the Patterson family. Their bodies showed signs of deliberate arsenic poisoning. The Graysons, however, had vanished, taking with them valuables, forged papers, and their murderous ledgers. But they had left enough behind to prove their guilt: a basement of catalogued possessions, hidden compartments, and Morai's chilling records. The Patterson family had been marked as Family Number 37, estimated profit $1,500, cause of death, slow integration, successful manipulation. Thanks to Catherine's survival, the truth about Sacred Heart Chapel could no longer be denied. The illusion had shattered. For the first time in years, the Graysons had failed. And for the first time, the world would know what had been happening on the trail to Oregon. The Patterson family, the survivors who exposed the truth, a prosperous family, walks into the trap. In late summer 1855, the Graysons encountered the Patterson family from Ohio, wealthy, well-respected, and devastatingly unaware of the danger ahead. Thomas Patterson, a successful merchant, had liquidated his business to seek new ventures in Oregon. He traveled with his wife Emily, their 4 children aged 8 to 16, and Emily's unmarried sister Catherine, who served as teacher and caregiver. Their wagon was well stocked, their clothes clean, and their confidence high. When Brother Ezekiel approached them 5 miles east of the chapel, he noted the family's polish and affluence immediately. "Quality oxen, sir," he greeted Thomas. "We keep fresh supplies up ahead if you care to trade." Though Thomas was initially skeptical, Ezekiel casually mentioned mountain fever spreading nearby. Emily's face changed instantly. A mother's fear for her children is often stronger than any man's reason. By nightfall, the Patterson family had arrived at Sacred Heart Chapel, completely unaware they were walking into a predator's den. The first to question. From the start, Catherine Patterson stood out. Intelligent, observant, and naturally skeptical, she was less susceptible to charm than her sister or nieces and nephews. When Sister Constance began administering herbal preventatives, Catherine accepted them politely, but secretly stored the medicine instead of drinking it. She noticed subtle things, how Ezekiel inventoried their wagon late at night, how Father Morai seemed more interested in Thomas's pocket watch than his prayers, and how Constance always prepared treatments behind locked doors. On the second evening, Catherine caught a glimpse of the white powder Constance added to a child's dose. Blessed salt, she was told. But Catherine had grown up in her father's apothecary back in Ohio. That wasn't salt. It wasn't even close. A silent decision to resist. Determined to uncover the truth, Catherine convinced young Timothy, the family's youngest child, to join her in a secret game. When offered medicine, they would pretend to swallow, but discreetly spit it into a handkerchief. Within 2 days, the difference was undeniable. While Thomas, Emily, and the other children began to weaken, Catherine and Timothy remained healthy. The twins developed fevers. Emily became fatigued. Thomas was bedbound. Catherine's fear turned into cold, deliberate calculation. She now knew the family was being poisoned, but how could she escape, especially with her sister slipping toward unconsciousness when Emily remained lucid enough to whisper her fears? Catherine told her everything. At first, Emily wept in disbelief. "They prayed with us," she gasped. But as the pattern became clearer, she understood. They had to run. A desperate midnight. Escape. On the 6th night, with her family dying around her, Catherine enacted her plan. She woke Emily and Timothy in the dead of night and helped them to the wagon where she had hidden gold coins, maps, and supplies. Thomas and the older children were too weak to move. The decision to leave them behind would haunt Catherine for the rest of her life. As they prepared to leave, they heard footsteps. Father Morai. "You should be resting, sister," he said, tone strangely flat. Mountain fever causes confusion, but Catherine played it calm. "I was checking on the oxen," she replied. "Couldn't sleep." Then suddenly Emily appeared behind the wagon, armed with Thomas's pistol. "Step away from my sister," she said, voice shaking. In that instant, Catherine grabbed an iron tool and struck Morai in the head. The blow wasn't fatal, but it was enough. They fled into the night, knowing they were now being hunted. 3 days through hell. The journey that followed was more nightmare than escape. With no map and only vague knowledge of nearby settlements, Catherine drove the wagon through dense forest, unfamiliar paths, and endless fear. Emily drifted in and out of consciousness, and young Timothy barely spoke. They avoided trails, moving like fugitives. On the 4th day, a miracle, they encountered a military patrol from Fort Daw. The soldiers were skeptical at first until Catherine produced the vial of medicine, the powder samples, and detailed testimony. Emily's failing condition confirmed the poisoning. Catherine's calm, precise recounting of events and the evidence she carried immediately triggered an investigation. Truth unveiled. Horror confirmed. When federal troops arrived at Sacred Heart Chapel, it was already too late for the rest of the Patterson family. Their bodies showed signs of deliberate arsenic poisoning. The Graysons, however, had vanished, taking with them valuables, forged papers, and their murderous ledgers. But they had left enough behind to prove their guilt: a basement of catalogued possessions, hidden compartments, and Morai's chilling records. The Patterson family had been marked as family number 37. Estimated profit $1,500. Cause of death: slow integration, successful manipulation. Thanks to Catherine's survival, the truth about Sacred Heart Chapel could no longer be denied. The illusion had shattered. For the first time in years, the Graysons had failed. And for the first time, the world would know what had been happening on the trail to Oregon. The trial justice for the forgotten, the courtroom that held a century of ghosts. The trial of the Grayson family began in September 1857 in San Francisco, a city quickly gaining notoriety for both its promise and its proximity to horrors of the frontier. Never before had the Western Territories seen such a spectacle: a public prosecution involving over 800 victims, dozens of family names, and one of the most meticulously documented murder enterprises in American history. News spread like wildfire across the country. Newspapers dubbed it the Devil's Mission Trial and the Preacher's Ledger of Death. Crowds gathered daily, packing the courthouse and spilling into streets, hoping to catch a glimpse of the accused or overhear a single sentence of testimony. Presiding over the case was Judge Raymond Tulliver, a stern, widely respected figure known for his intolerance toward legal theatrics. But even he admitted on record that he had never encountered a case so dark, so vast, and so devastating to the public trust. The prosecution, led by Territorial Attorney General Samuel Morrison, opened with a simple statement: "This is not the trial of 3 murderers. This is the reckoning of a plague in human form, disguised in prayer and piety." The evidence that spoke for the dead central to the trial were the documents found at both Sacred Heart Chapel and the Mission of Divine Mercy, detailed ledgers maintained by Father Macabre Grayson himself. These books recorded not only names, dates, and possessions taken, but chilling observations like "compliant mother," "double dose accepted," and "wagon broken, ideal opportunity." Experts testified that the handwriting matched across all records, and investigators cross-verified many of the listed families with missing persons reports filed as far east as Missouri and Ohio. The prosecution didn't have to rely solely on surviving witnesses. The dead had already spoken through the Graysons' own journals. Among the most damning pieces was an entry that read, "Patterson, children too weak for travel, matriarch emotionally broken. Success inevitable. Method wine, estimated value $1,520. Recovery rate excellent. Catherine Patterson in court every day, sat with her hands folded tightly, her face a stone mask of focus and pain. When called to the stand, she testified clearly and without embellishment, offering a detailed narrative of her family's decline, her discovery of the poison, and her escape. The jury, many of whom had grown up hearing tales of trail heroes and pioneers, now heard the truth of what some pioneers faced: spiritual predators who weaponized trust, defiance, silence, and collapse. The 3 defendants reacted to the trial with striking contrast. Father Macabre, gaunt and pale but still composed, offered no apology. When asked directly if he regretted anything, he replied, "I regret not being better understood." He viewed himself as a spiritual realist, someone who saw the inevitability of death and chose to profit from it. His defense tried to paint the murders as mercy killings framed by hardship and disease. But the calculated nature of the poisonings and the obsessive record-keeping crushed that defense entirely. Sister Constance, now known as Sister Mary, remained stoic until cross-examination, when she finally snapped at the prosecution. "Those children were dying anyway. We gave them peace." Her words sent a ripple of nausea through the courtroom. Ezekiel, Brother Thomas, never spoke during the entire trial. His eyes remained lowered, his demeanor unreadable. When pressed by his own defense attorney, he declined to answer questions, offering only a muttered, "I did what I was told." No remorse, no justification, no humanity. It became painfully clear to everyone in attendance that the Graysons had not only dehumanized their victims, they had dehumanized themselves. Verdicts, sentences, and the echoes that remain. On the 42nd day of the trial, the jury returned its verdict guilty on all counts. Father Moriah Grayson was sentenced to death by public hanging, the first such sentence in California, for crimes committed across multiple territories. Sister Constance received life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Her sentence was historic, the first woman in the state's judicial history to be convicted as the orchestrator of mass murder. Brother Ezekiel was sentenced to 20 years for conspiracy accomplice to murder and concealment of evidence. As the verdict was read, Catherine Patterson wept for the first time, not from grief, but from release. Justice, though delayed, had arrived. But its echoes would remain long after the noose tightened around Moriah's neck. Communities across the frontier began holding memorials for the lost. Families who had given up hope for news of vanished relatives finally had answers, horrific but truthful. In Oregon, the remains at Sacred Heart Chapel were exhumed and reburied in a public cemetery. A monument was erected nearby, inscribed with the words, "They sought salvation and met betrayal." We remember them not as victims, but as warnings. The Grayson trial changed the landscape of Westwood Trust forever. Never again would travelers take kindness from strangers at face value, not without wondering what horrors might wear the mask of a smile. Legacy of horror lessons from the trail, a wound that changed the West. The story of the Grayson family did not end at the gallows, nor behind the barred windows of Sister Constance's cell. It echoed far beyond the courtroom, shaping how an entire generation viewed religion, trust, and vulnerability on the frontier. Until their crimes were uncovered, missionaries were often seen as untouchable pillars of virtue. Afterward, however, a cloud of suspicion began to surround even legitimate religious outposts. Families, once eager to accept help from strangers, became guarded and withdrawn. Federal authorities noted a sharp increase in reports of suspicious behavior near trail missions. Many of them false alarms, but all of them rooted in genuine fear. The Graysons hadn't just murdered people. They had infected the cultural bloodstream of the American West with paranoia. Religious workers who had devoted their lives to helping settlers found themselves met with doubt, even hostility. Trust once freely given in the wilderness had become something that had to be earned inch by inch, and sometimes never recovered. The rise of safeguards and federal oversight. In the wake of the trial, the federal government instituted several changes that reshaped frontier life. One of the most immediate was the formation of dedicated patrol units tasked with investigating unregistered settlements and religious compounds near major travel routes. The Sacred Heart case had revealed a glaring weakness in frontier oversight: the lack of communication between territories, the absence of missing persons coordination, and the failure to vet individuals claiming religious authority. By late 1858, a new system was established, allowing local sheriffs and marshals to cross-reference reports of disappearances and suspected fraud. The government also began requiring religious missions to maintain public records of visitors and activities, something previously considered unnecessary and even insulting. Missionaries who once operated under the assumption of moral immunity were now subject to background checks and occasional inspections. Though imperfect, these safeguards saved lives in the decades that followed. Historians estimate that without such reforms, other opportunistic killers may have followed in the Graysons' footsteps, cloaking predation in piety and exploiting the blind spots of a lawless frontier. The haunting of the survivors. For Catherine Patterson and her nephew Timothy, survival came at a terrible cost. Emily Patterson, Catherine's sister, succumbed to arsenic-related complications less than a year after their escape, her body unable to recover from the long exposure. Catherine never married. She dedicated her life to helping other travelers working with law enforcement to expose fraudulent missions and providing aid to widows and orphans affected by westward expansion. She lived the rest of her days haunted by the memory of the siblings she left behind, and the moment she struck Father Morai with an iron tool to save her own life. She testified in 3 more related cases in the years that followed, and her journals would later serve as a foundation for early forensic study in the American justice system. As for Timothy, he grew into a quiet, withdrawn man, never forming a family of his own. He spent his adulthood as a guide on the Oregon Trail, warning travelers of the dangers of misplaced trust. Though he rarely spoke of what happened, he never again entered a church. To him, salvation had worn the face of a lie, a symbolic reckoning for America. The Grayson case came to symbolize a deeper moral reckoning for America in the mid-19th century. As the country pushed westward, it celebrated ideals of courage, ambition, and divine destiny. But the Grayson murders laid bare the truth that expansion also opened vast doors for exploitation. It showed that evil was not always loud or savage. It could be calm, articulate, and dressed in the robes of virtue. The story struck a nerve in a nation already grappling with questions of morality, justice, and spiritual authority. Clergy across the country were forced to publicly address the case, not only condemning the Graysons, but also reflecting on how religious trust could be twisted into manipulation. Theologians began publishing tracts on the dangers of unchecked spiritual power, and a number of churches adopted stricter codes of accountability for traveling missionaries. Though America continued to idolize the frontier spirit, a new caution took root, a recognition that not all who offered salvation were saints, and not every chapel was sacred. A legacy, not of evil, but of warning. Today, more than a century and a half after the Grayson family was brought to justice, their legacy remains not as a tale of pure evil, but as a profound warning. The remains of Sacred Heart Chapel were burned by local authorities in 1858. The mission of Divine Mercy was dismantled stone by stone. But their story survives in archives, in oral histories, and in the cultural memory of a nation shaped by both aspiration and atrocity. Memorials now stand where victims were buried anonymously, their names etched into plaques by descendants of those they never met. Educational programs use the Grayson case as a study in psychological manipulation, spiritual abuse, and systemic oversight failure. Perhaps most powerfully, their crimes continue to force us to confront an uncomfortable truth. Evil does not always come with horns and fire. Sometimes it comes with scripture, a gentle hand, and a promise to help. And in remembering that we honor not only the dead, but the courage of those who survived long enough to tell the truth. Epilogue. When salvation wears a mask. The story of the Grayson family is more than a chronicle of murder. It is a reminder of how evil often dresses itself in the garments we trust most: charity, kindness, and faith. On the American frontier, where survival depended not only on strength but on human connection, the Graysons weaponized that very trust. They turned salvation into a trap prayer into poison, and the sanctuary of a chapel into a slaughterhouse. But for every soul they silenced, there were echoes that could not be buried. The ledgers they left behind, the memories etched in survivors' minds, and the lessons passed from one generation to the next continue to speak long after the chapel's walls turn to ash. In a world still wrestling with whom to believe and how much to trust, the legacy of the Grayson murders is a quiet warning: not all who smile are saviors, and not all who speak of God come with clean hands. We remember the victims not only to honor their suffering, but to protect the future from forgetting. And as long as their story is told, evil, no matter how pious its disguise, will never truly be safe in the shadows again.